Yo, 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 we've returned from the dead, making our great comeback. Been gone for many, many months. Going to talk about a few things today.
We have not been gone for that long, okay? I uploaded the new episode about the Trump assassination attempt.
Look, okay, that one was like sped up audio. You were absent, okay? It's not the official Rational Sophistry lineup. It was like me, Ethan, and Henry, not me, Ethan, and Bro Machine. Now we finally have a real pod back together.
The threesome is back together, okay?
Bro.
So, I don't know. We're just going to talk about the presidential debates, and then we'll have an extra special segment where we talk about philosophy, because we don't have that much to say about the presidential debates.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about theism, and we're going to strike the fear of God into all of your hearts. So,
all right, bless up. Well, in the name of God, let's start off with the first segment then. So we had the first presidential debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump on Tuesday night. So that was 2 days ago now. And it looks like by most accounts, Kamala Harris won. It seems that CNN polling shows this. I think YouGov has some polling that shows the same thing. As far as I can tell, most commentators who aren't like explicitly super right-wing also thought that Kamala won. But I don't know. Do you have any special thoughts or insights about the debate?
Yeah, no, I guess like also just to add to the indicators you mentioned, like also like Kamala went up in the betting markets after the debate happened, and also I think like the betting markets also like basically seemed to indicate that she won pretty clearly. And I guess like, yeah, my general thoughts on the debate, I don't have like that much to say. I guess what I would say is my mindset for evaluating the debate, and in terms of evaluating who won, like isn't so much like, who's doing the best, like factually or substantively. Like obviously like both people during the debate like avoided or dodged questions that would make them look bad. They probably said things that like weren't true, although one person probably said more of those things that weren't true. But I'm very much like thinking like, okay, like how good would they come off to like the average like person who isn't that politically decided or something like that, who's relatively like neutral. And I think like definitely like I think it would probably be Kamala Harris. Like she came off like much calmer, much more like non-unhinged. She had like, several good like gotchas, several moments where she was like pressing Trump on a variety of things, stuff like abortion, performance like during COVID, the economy, stuff like that. So yeah, I would say that you probably did the best of the two. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have that much to say about it, but I mean, Trump was being a bit more. I guess Trump was it seemed like a sort of return to form for Trump in some sense. He was being, very aggressive and very unhinged, much like his sort of old self. I feel like it's been a while since we've seen him like that. Kamala was being, for the most part, unremarkable in most respects. I mean, she was about what I expected. She was, calm, measured, trying to kind of come off like the less radical, less unhinged party that's going to unify America, etc., trying to sort of go for this more moderate appeal. And then, yeah, I mean, in terms of they both told lies and said things that were false and immoral, but Trump obviously takes the cake in terms of that competition. And then just in terms of like how it's going to impact the election, I would guess not much, but to the extent that it is going to have an impact on the election, that impact is probably going to favor Kamala Harris, as indicated by the fact that the polls said most people who viewed the debate thought she won. The betting markets have gone her way post-debate more than Trump. Although it is worth noting there's a confounder there, which is the same night of the debate, Taylor Swift endorsed Kamala Harris. She's obviously like the biggest celebrity in the U.S. right now, so maybe that's also having some influence. So maybe it would be hasty to infer something about the debate performances just from the fact that the betting markets showed an increase for Kamala after the debate. But in any case, like to the extent that we have indicators that suggest a winner in the mind of the average voter, it would be Kamala. But again, debates very rarely have an extremely substantial impact on elections, etc. So I wouldn't make too much of it.
Yeah. Well, there were a few things I wanted to note there. First of all, I think there were markets that were more specifically tailored about the debate. So, I believe that Polymarket or Predictit had a bet on whether or not Kamala Harris would be shown by direct post-debate polling to be the victor of the debate. And I think by the end of the debate, the polling was at 96% or something like that. So clearly people, when mostly focusing on the debate, thought that Kamala Harris had won, according to the betting markets.
Wait, just to clarify, when it said that Polymarket had a betting market on who would win the debate according to the polls, were they talking about who would see a post-debate boost in general polling, or was it about who would the polls say? Was the market directed towards the outcome of specifically the polls that were taken on who won the debate?
Yeah, so it was directed towards the sort of focus groups that CNN does or whatever after the debate, to determine the effect of the debate on polling specifically. I think that, as far as I recall, the Taylor Swift endorsement wasn't until later that night in any case. So it was the direct post-debate polling among people who had watched the debate in presumably some focus group environment or something like that. I'm not exactly sure how it works.
Yeah, well, to be fair, I think we did mention Kamala just did win the debate according to those polls. I'm just saying that I don't know if there's additional evidence from betting markets that you don't already get just from the fact that she won according to polling. I mean, maybe the way you would do it is you might go and see how the markets were shifting after the debate, but before the Taylor Swift endorsement. Although the Taylor Swift endorsement did come pretty quickly after the debate, so I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, you might also just take it these people who watch the debate and then bet on whether the polls would come out in favor of Kamala. Presumably, them thinking that and being willing to put their money where their mouth is on that means they're pretty confident, that most people who watch the debate would have thought she won it,
Well, that will hinge on the
polls. So
that would hinge on the reliability of the polls themselves,
right? But I guess if they think that the polls are systematically biased towards Kamala, then you're right. That might.
Yeah, but I don't
well,
really likely that they think that. But
I mean,
maybe.
Regardless, I mean, I think one thing that should change your view on this is that prior to the debate, the polling was much closer to 50-50. So it's unlikely that during the debate, people realized that somehow the CNN sample group was super biased. So probably it actually reflects the debate performance, right?
Well, that's not that wouldn't be the only possibility that would lead to the result. It could be, for instance, and I'm not saying this is particularly likely, but these are all just possibilities that we have to keep in mind. What if it was 50-50 because people thought that, Trump would, I guess it depends on what the baseline expectation was, right? Because even if you think that there's a systematic bias in favor of Kamala, if you think Trump is going to do much better such that the polls will still show him winning, even despite the systematic bias, or at least that there's a decent chance of that. then you might still put like your money on Trump.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. I mean, right, that's sure a possibility. I think it's not that likely of a possibility, but regardless, I think we can confidently say that Kamala outperformed what the betting markets seemed to think that she would do, going right into the debate, because their probability raised as the debate progressed.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the case that yeah, I mean, people, as the debate progressed, people's like Kamala did better than expected, sure. At least in the betting market.
In any case, yeah, about the Taylor Swift announcement, pretty based. I saw that something like 337,000 people have used the URL that she posted to sign up to register to vote, which is pretty good, considering that the election may well be decided by margins of a few tens of thousands in certain states. 300,000 is no laughing matter, to be sure.
It's sort of fascinating. You read like the post. I think the main issues she mentioned were like LGBT rights, like abortion, and like IVF. It's kind of interesting because, like, you don't really think of Taylor Swift as like that explicitly political. I mean, if anything, she kind of gives like mixed vibes, I would say, in terms of her political tendencies. I mean, she rose as like a country star, etc. It's kind of interesting. Like, it seems like that's a good sort of like microcosm example of like the kinds of issues on which like conservatives tend to alienate the group of people that Taylor Swift kind of represents. Like this mostly like apolitical group of like white, women, etc. Like I couldn't imagine.
Hanania wrote a Substack article called "Taylor Swift is the Median Voter," which is it's paywalled, so I haven't read the entire thing, but the title is certainly interesting.
Indeed, yeah. I think I think this is maybe veering slightly off topic, but I mean I think that generally both political sides do worse when they make a big deal out of what are seen as sort of radical approaches to social or cultural issues or whatever. I think that's maybe one of the big political disadvantages of the Trump campaign, is he comes off kind of unhinged on it. I mean, he kind of has walked back and forth his abortion take a bit, I guess. But yeah, it seems like the Republicans are suffering with a certain demographic due to their more radical stances on certain social issues. And I think that's one of the things that's like indicated by the Taylor Swift endorsement.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly the moment in the debate where he had to disavow what J.D. Vance said about his abortion policy was like kind of embarrassing.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I thought the sections on abortion ultimately ended up going like somewhat poorly for Trump. Bro Machine, did you have like any thing like especially interesting to say on the like what was said during the debate and the overall performances?
Yeah. Or sure. Well, this is sort of peripherally related, but I think it's sufficiently funny to bring up. On September 11th, Time magazine issued a correction to their fact check of the debate. The correction reads: "The original version of this story mischaracterized as false Donald Trump's statement accusing Kamala Harris of supporting, quote, transgender operations on illegal aliens in prison. As a presidential candidate in 2019, Harris filled out a questionnaire saying she supported taxpayer-funded gender transition treatment for detained immigrants." So wow, kind of crazy that one turned out to be true.
Yeah, that's funny. That's
hilarious.
Yeah.
How about you? Do you have any? You have any highlights?
I did have something to say, but then I forgot about what I had to say. So.
Oh, as normal, as usual.
It'll come back. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think other than that, the debate was not terribly crazy. I was surprised to see that apparently some CNN and YouGov polling had Kamala winning by the same margins as Trump won by in his first debate against Biden, which seems sort of unreal. Like, it seems very unintuitive to me the first debate about against Biden seemed like a total knockout for Trump. Like Biden just looked terrible, and this even at Trump's worst moments, he just looked a little deranged. But I can't imagine that a really hardcore Trump supporter is going to start doubting now. But I don't know. Maybe I just have the wrong intuitions. What do you guys think?
Well, I mean, a hardcore Trump supporter is not going to
Yeah,
have their
like
mind
maybe,
changed by a debate, like in
yeah,
general, I guess.
like maybe
Um,
it's more so like maybe like moderates in the middle or people like that she's getting to during the debate. Like she just looks, much more competent than Biden did in this debate.
Right. Although,
Yeah.
I like my impression is that even among people who were previously pretty bullish on Biden, uh, the Biden debate performance actually significantly shifted their belief in him winning. That he ended up being forced out by like a lot of
Mhm.
Democratic Party insiders. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I think maybe it's like a combination of like, okay, like Biden like lost even a lot of his like most bullish supporters, and like, looked incompetent and like weak to most people in the middle. But then it's like basically like if you have someone who's like much more like sane and but doesn't look like, incompetent, who looks competent alongside like Trump, like, he's always gonna end up like alienating like maybe like more moderate looking people, and maybe she did like again like somewhat better than expected. So maybe that, plus like the people, like these like never Trumper people who are always going to vote for the Democrat became more competent, and she scooped up enough people in the middle or something like that, and that was enough to do well. Of course, like but yeah, I would doubt that it's from her like convincing hardcore Trump supporters or anything.
do you
yeah. What do you
we
guys
were
think? Oh, sorry.
I was gonna ask if you remember like a single good Trump zinger from this debate. I can't actually think of any.
I thought it was kind of funny. I mean, not any like good creative zingers, but just kind of like, there was some classic, like just kind of Trump like aggression that I thought was kind of funny. Like when he's like, I remember at one point Kamala said something, and Trump was like, "Oh, that was like that's a pre-rehearsed line. They told her to say that or something." That was kind of funny. Or like the part where he was like Kamala, I'm speaking.
Yeah,
You
true. You
recognize
remember that?
that
Yeah,
or
that was pretty
yeah,
good. That was pretty funny.
Yeah, I also liked when he just like started like calling her a Marxist and railing on her because she has a
yeah,
Marxist
that was
father.
hilarious.
When he
That
just
was,
started railing her, that was pretty crazy on stage.
that
That was
was
so fun.
crazy.
Dude.
Yeah, I don't think that was a good look. But
Yeah, what were you thinking?
yeah, what oh yeah, what do you guys think about, because people are complaining that like the moderator is biased. Which is kind of true. I mean, the moderator was definitely challenging Trump more than he was challenging Harris. Um And you might contemplate like the political implications of that. Like, does that look good or bad for Trump to like the average debate viewer? But also just like you can ask like, well, is it fair? Is it indicative of like bias? I mean, it seems sort of like hasty to infer some sort of bias due to the fact that Trump is getting fact checked more. Just given that there's like a sort of obvious alternative explanation, which is that like Trump lies more frequently and in more egregious ways than Harris. And so like if you have a moderator who's just neutrally concerned with calling out egregious lies, you just expect him to um, you would just expect him to be more on Trump than on Harris for that. I mean, you can fairly point out that there were some lies that Harris told um, that was not checked by the moderator. But again, Harris's lies were both more subtle and less frequent than Trump's. So I guess it's not that surprising to me.
Mhm.
I don't know. What do you guys think?
Uh, no, that makes sense. I mean, I also think like I mean there may be other things that also support that. Like for instance, like one thing that I distinctively recall, although maybe I'm like misremembering like selectively here, is like I do remember like quite a few times like the moderators would like allow like Trump to like get in a last word or have like a response to Harris when they were already like, going to move on. And so they'd let him give a response and like have the last word. And then a couple of times they didn't like let Harris do that, whereas you would think if they were like being like super biased, like they wouldn't, it wouldn't have turned out that way. So maybe that does support. Trump just said more false things, and so of course they checked him more because they're, concerned with, I guess, like fact checking like false statements. He said more obviously false things, but maybe my memory there is just
so on every. You're actually right about that. Trump had the first word on 8 topics, and Harris had the first word on 7 topics. But Trump had the last word on every single topic. And many cases like went around after Harris was supposed to be given the last word to get his last word in. So yeah, I do think you're right that the moderators, I think I'm not sure it's indicative of them trying to avoid being biased. It's just that Trump is a lot more belligerent than Harris is when it comes to trying to get the last word. I mean, optically, I just think it would make a lot of sense for them to at least correct Harris once. I mean, optically, in terms of maximizing the credibility of the moderators themselves to the viewer. I'm not sure, I'm not sure it's net good for the world if they would correct Harris more. But in any case, I agree. I think there were many cases where they corrected Trump. That was probably good. I wish that we had an actual live fact check during the debate. Like, you could just have text at the bottom where you have people live fact checking things that happened 1 minute ago. But I think that'd be too unpopular for Trump to ever agree to.
Yeah, that's fair. Some way of ensuring that it's not biased. Maybe maybe it's AI or something. Who knows?
Right. Famously unbiased AI.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. I think unless anyone else had anything else to say, I think we've like kind of exhausted this. I think. There's not much more to say about it.
So Ethan said yesterday, when we were talking, as we do, like friends outside of this podcast, that he doesn't think that the problem of evil is the best argument against theism. So what do you think the best argument against theism is then, Ethan?
The argument from the size of the universe, I would say. Well, you think about it, you look at it, and it's like the universe is so large, and it's so old, and humans exist on such a late and local portion of it, that you just think like, could God really exist,
Yeah, no, I think I'm going to have to. Yeah, no, I think theism has been decisively refuted. Yeah.
I mean, maybe that does have some evidential force.
No, I do think it does have some, because it's like I feel like you wouldn't like if you have like an all good being who wants to promote like things of value, you might not expect there to be this big universe that's like so old yet for like so much of its time, there was nothing of value, basically, no consciousness.
Yeah. I actually think that's the best argument. Like sometimes I don't know, I just want to be a contrarian. I just want to like go against the grain. So I kind of knee jerk disagree with what other people are saying. But like, for being real,
no, surely not you.
If we're being real, obviously the problem of evil is far and away the best argument.
I think the best argument is that, what has nothing good ever fucking happened to me? Okay, if God was real, I'd be way luckier. But I'm so fucked. All right.
Yeah, like you're a cock for one, So.
Okay, that's for 5, if you count up all the men.
True.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I don't know. Good responses to the problem of evil. Michael, are you particularly sympathetic to any of them?
Well, I mean, I was wondering, one thing you might say really quickly before we talk about the problem of evil, just because I brought up the point about, space and time. I mean, one difficulty for that argument, it seems to me, I mean, I haven't thought about it much, but one difficulty is just, it seems like we're not in a very good position to talk about how much of the universe is covered by life, and especially how much of the universe will be covered by life. for what percentage of the universe's history. So we're not in a good position to estimate what percentage of the universe will be covered in life for what percentage of its history. And, you might have all these different, I think Robin Hanson believes that most of the, we're particularly early in the universe's history, and for most of its history, it will be filled by, expanding life, conscious life. And if that's the case, is that particularly unexpected on theism? I don't know, maybe not. At least a lot of the intuitive force of the argument starts to seem to fade in light of those hypotheses. I don't know. Anyways.
Yeah, I agree with.
Surely, as the probability of theism rises, the probability of incredible AI caused suffering or catastrophe should go down at least marginally, right? God wouldn't put us in a universe where we're just going to get tortured forever by an evil AI overlord.
Okay. Yeah, so I think we all agree that the best response to the problem of evil, and the most convincing response, at least for the three of us, is the multiverse theodicy. So the idea of the multiverse theodicy is basically just that, okay, so the problem of evil is just that, look, there are lots of ways in which the world is bad. There's lots of suffering, many of it seemingly pointless. And it seems like the world could be way more optimal in a variety of ways, And so antecedently, you just wouldn't expect, the distribution of things like suffering and other stuff like that, and the particular roles it plays under theism, whereas you would expect it under some hypothesis where reality is be indifferent to suffering or the value of conscious creatures or something. So the idea of the multiverse theodicy is they say, well, God made, a perfect universe, where maybe a perfect universe might be one where nobody ever suffers, everyone is happy, they all have great relationships. There's never any danger or whatever, yada, yada, yada. But then there are also a bunch of other universes he could have created that are good, but imperfect. That is, they have more things of value in them than things that are bad. They have more people in doing enjoyable activities, having happy relationships, engaging in interesting activities, building virtue, yada yada, whatever you think is good. But of course, they have some amount of suffering and hardship, some amount of evil in them. But they're still, these are worlds that are still net good. You'd prefer that these worlds exist rather than that they not exist. They're just imperfect. And so then the idea is, well, look, if God can create the perfect world, but then he can also create all the imperfect worlds that are still good and still worth creating, that have more good than bad in them, then he can just create all of them. He can create the perfect world and all of these worlds and have more total value in reality, or have reality be better. And then the idea is, well, if that's true, then you might think it's completely unsurprising that we end up in a world that's imperfect and inoptimal in a variety of respects, and has quite a bit of suffering in it, so long as it's net good. And so then if someone wants to make the case that God doesn't exist, they instead need to argue that this world is net bad and it's not net good, which seems way harder to argue than that there is, that there's evil or suffering in the world, and just give an idea, now, whenever we see, some instance of horrific evil or something, someone dying in some random accident or whatever, and we ask well, wouldn't it have been better? Isn't it unexpected that something so random would have happened? Wouldn't it have been better to create a world where the person didn't suffer? Or wouldn't it have been better for God to intervene here? Well, we would say God's already made such a universe where he intervenes, and saves the person. It's just, there's also a world where he doesn't intervene and this person suffers, but the rest of the world is still good. There's still more good than bad. So he'd also create that one where he doesn't intervene. So that's the basic idea, I take it.
Yeah. So I wanted to point out a couple of things about this, which we could discuss. The first thing is that if you believe in the multiverse theodicy, in many ways it might somewhat weaken your ability to use certain types of fine-tuning arguments, because if you're not arguing that our world is the best possible world, because God doesn't just create the best possible world, God creates all worlds that are net positive, then that means that the things that give evidence for God is just anything that makes our world net positive. But it might not be that unlikely under naturalism that the world's net positive either. So the point is just that the theory for what God creates in the world becomes somewhat less specific, and therefore you have less ability to update or use like Bayesian arguments on that basis. Um, yeah, I mean, does that generally seem right? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's like true. Well, sorry. So is the idea like basically that there are like lots of net good worlds, where like what isn't the case?
Well, any particular feature that you observe might not be the case, and so for unless you can argue that like sort of the vast majority of net positive worlds have this feature, then your predictions become significantly less specific, and so as a result, you don't have as much of like an update factor.
Well,
Yeah.
seemingly,
So I think that I think that um maybe that's true for certain kinds of evidence, but like it still seems like we'd expect like a few baseline things. So like for instance, and it seems pretty plausible that most of the things that make the world most valuable have to do with conscious creatures. So, that's going to be things like pleasure and happiness, relationships, virtue, love, knowledge, stuff like that. Um, and so, like, presumably, you're going to need like conscious creatures for all of those things. And so, then, like, minimally, it seems like you're going to need a world that permits um, conscious creatures, or we could say maybe conscious life or stuff like that. So it seems like you'd still pretty strongly expect that. And so then you can use like arguments relating to conditions permitting conscious life or just the existence of consciousness. We just expect, most worlds that are worth creating to have like consciousness in them. So that's like one thing I would say to that. Do you have any thoughts, Ethan?
yeah, I was just gonna say you might think that the class of worlds which are like net good, um, like well, okay, and there's another thing too, which is just that like the fact that God creates all of these net good worlds that don't have fine tuning um, won't be that relevant to the force of the argument insofar as the worlds we're talking about are ones that we couldn't have existed in. Now, there will be non fine tuned worlds that we could have existed in, presumably, and so maybe theism loses some explanatory power in that sense. But the point is, like, imagine a world that's net good, but like the goodness consists in, I don't know, some like aesthetic value or like natural value, but there's like no conscious creatures, like the fact that worlds like that are now among the worlds that God creates doesn't seem that relevant to the fine tuning data because we couldn't have observed ourselves in those worlds, right? Like, in the same way that if you're like a naturalist who believes in like a multiverse, I don't know. You guys kind of get the point, I'm sure.
Yeah, I get the point. Yeah.
The
I do. I mean, I think maybe one of the things is just it like makes me less sure that theism predicts that you have to have some super like well structured world that's very consistent, right? Like I could imagine that you have universes full of Boltzmann brains, or like that have a few Boltzmann brains that are net positive because the Boltzmann brain flashes into existence, feels like a little bit of joy, and then flashes out of existence again, and that still makes the world like barely net positive.
This might depend like somewhat on your like view, so like for instance, well, there are a couple of things to say. Like one is you might have this like view where it's like part of what makes you well off or part of what's valuable, is like actually like, you living some like long life where you're well off, and also like some a life where you actually have like functioning rational faculties and it can infer, like about what's going on around you in the world, and discover like truths and reason about the world well. And also, you might think like having like kind of like a well structured world where, you can like make decisions and interact with things like that's probably going to be needed to like build relationships with others, which you might think is like also another valuable thing. So if you think those things I mentioned are valuable, then you might think like, well, actually, like, no, maybe, those like, Boltzmann brain worlds you discuss, like actually, those are going to be like very like few and far between.
Right, except we're only talking about net valuable
yeah,
worlds, so the point is just that like you'd have to think the lack of long-term relationships is like actively counting against the worlds. Yeah.
And also like, induct, rationally functioning like faculties and things like if, for instance, if you say, well, they have like, they're missing out on all of these things, but they just have like barely enough, pleasure, more pleasure than like pain or something like that, then like it becomes like way less obvious that like actually that world isn't that good,
Well, yeah, that's what I was gonna say is like it depends on obviously like your ethics and like your metaphysics and so on. And I just think that a lot of theists will accept views where like this sort of Boltzmann brain world won't be that good, where it's like if for instance you think that like what fundamentally matters is like like if you have like a virtue ethics view, for example, where like what fundamentally matters is people like, developing their characters in the face of strife and adversity and achieving their like distinct individual purposes and so on. If you think that like that's basically what matters fundamentally, then, kind of having like conscious creatures, maybe with like fake implanted backstories, kind of pop into existence briefly and then like experience a little bit of orgasmic pleasure and then fade out of existence. Like the theist will just say like, why would I think that's good again? Like why would I think that's the kind of thing that God would be better off creating than just not creating? But obviously, if you accept the kinds of like deranged, like modernistic, like nihilistic, like hedonistic, utilitarian views that Drum Machine accepts, this argument might be forceful,
I thought you were gonna end another word with "IC," but that's fine.
Yeah. I mean, there's also like another
materialistic, atheistic, naturalistic, nihilistic.
Yeah, but I mean, there's also like another worry.
Open relationshipistic.
And there's also another worry, which is that like you need to remember too, like if you're going to create a bunch of worlds together, like it's like possible that like which worlds you create together could like affect the value of them. So like what do I mean by that? Well, like we might think that basically think that like okay, like what like part of what justifies me in like believing in things like induction, or believing, like yeah, like I like live in a world where I'm not deceived and I can actually reason well about the world and stuff like that. Well, we might think, well, part of what justifies me in believing that is that, well, I should be able to think that, like, okay, like this like world was like selected, the world that I exist in was selected, or is such that it was very likely to conform to, like induction, to be like regular and uniform, and be like such that it's capable of investigation by like a being like me with like rational faculties. And so like you might think that, well, like imagine God just like makes he doesn't care about like selecting worlds such that like ones with that are inductively regular and suitable for like rational creatures, like or something like that. Like imagine he just doesn't care about selecting worlds on that basis, and so then he just like selects them at random, and so then you get a bunch of like worlds that are not inductively regular at all. Well, if like I think he would do that, if I think he would do that, then maybe I should think like, okay, well, actually, maybe I'm not likely to be in a world that's inductively regular or suitable to a rational creature. Maybe I'm actually in one of those worlds that's not inductively regular, and I just haven't realized it yet. So like then like now like I don't have any confidence at all in like, my like rational faculties, So like you might think, well, it's like it would be very important to God to only make worlds that are inductively regular such that we can continue to trust that there was some like, mechanism or reason like why we should expect ourselves to end up in like inductively regular worlds.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a good point.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a couple other like one is that it just like well, it seems like what you need, and to be clear, this is all like all of my thoughts on this are sort of tentative, because I agree that this point about the multiverse theodicy and explanatory power seems like a real like concern, and I haven't actually thought about it that much. But just like these are like some tentative thoughts. I mean, one is just that um, really all you would need for like the fine tuning argument, for instance, to still have force is that so now we have this pool of worlds that God creates, and there's some narrower subset of that pool that we could have found ourselves in, right? And then the issue is, okay, well then what are the odds that we would have found ourselves in one with fine tuning? And then so the answer will just be in what proportion of net positive possible worlds with like conscious observers in them is the world like finely tuned? And presumably you could argue that the number is bigger than like the number of say fine-tuned worlds on like naturalism, or like the number of worlds that are finely tuned that are consistent with the naturalist, a sort of bare naturalist hypothesis. And I mean, but another concern is that things sort of get weird when we start counting like infinities, I guess, So if there's like infinite sort of iterations of like each net positive possible world, and even if there are just infinite net positive possible worlds, it seems like how do you assess like the relative probabilities then? It sort of starts becoming difficult. You might try and come up with some measure of like different worlds, different kinds of features, or different like kinds of worlds being like having like a higher density within the infinite set of net positive worlds or something like that. And you could make arguments that if you look at like the space of net positive worlds, it seems like most of them are going to require certain like preconditions, like Darren mentioned, like for instance, the possibility of like sort of consistent, like organized, complex, on, and on a sort of broader construal of the fine tuning argument, that's just what we mean by fine tuning. So you'd expect most net positive possible worlds to involve something relevantly like fine tuning, or at least a high enough percentage of them that it comes out as higher than the percentage of naturalist worlds that are fine tuned.
Before we talk about other stuff, I thought maybe we could talk about the only other sort of major issue I see with the theodicy, with the multiverse theodicy, which is this the identity of indiscernibles and like how you think God creates worlds. I don't know. We talked about this before, Ethan, so I thought maybe you'd want to introduce it, since you seem to have a good grasp of what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, it gets tricky. So there's this question which is like, okay, well, why would God create every net positive world when he could, when he could just create only the best possible world and just keep doing it over and over and over? So, why doesn't he just say, so instead of creating every net positive possible world, why doesn't he just only create the best possible world sort of infinite times? And wouldn't that be better than creating every net positive possible world? I mean, I think that whether this objection has force, to me, it just seems like sort of a matter of how we're thinking about the process by which God goes about creating worlds. This was suggested to me by I brought this sort of objection to the multiverse theodicy to a philosophy student friend of mine who's a theist, and so what I'm about to say is kind of what he suggested. But like there's multiple ways, I guess, of modeling, basically God's creative process. And one way of doing it is that basically God, creates a world, and then he sort of, once he's done creating that world, then he goes on and he starts creating another world. And he creates each world sort of individually in this more or less sequential fashion, And if that's sort of how God goes about creating worlds, then the duplication objection will have force, because it's like, well, why at any stage in that process would God ever choose to create a world that's anything less than perfect? Like, that would just seem completely gratuitous. And the reason for that is because in this way of modeling the way that God's creative process works, it seems like there's a sort of built-in like opportunity cost to creating an imperfect world. So for God to create an imperfect world, that means that instance where he created that imperfect world, he could have, rather than doing that, created a perfect world, and so why didn't he? But, the point is just, that is not the only way of thinking about how God's creative process works, Like, it could be, for instance, that, there's just like these set of metaphysically possible worlds that are sort of like co-eternal with God. And when God creates, he basically surveys the space of possible worlds. And he sort of selects which ones he wants to actualize, and then he actualizes all of the sort of regions of possibility space that he wants to actualize in like a simultaneous fashion. I mean, that's obviously like a crude way of setting it up. I'm just kind of trying to give like an intuitive kind of explanation of how you might think about a different way of God's creative modeling God's creative process. And so if you think about it in that way, then, okay, well, it seems like there's no opportunity cost involved in creating net positive but imperfect worlds. And so it might just seem kind of pointless for God to, like, if God is sort of just drawing a circle around the regions of possibility space that he wants to actualize, and then creating them all simultaneously, it might just seem sort of pointless and like morally wasteful to draw the circle narrower such that it only includes the very best worlds, rather than drawing a broader circle that includes other good but imperfect worlds. Like, you might think that just, you're leaving out extra goodness that you could have included, like, why would you do that? Now, obviously, even if you model God's creative process in that way, such that there's seemingly no opportunity cost, you still might think that it's controversial for like sort of infinitarian ethics reasons, like, you might think like, well, no, because the quantities of goodness are sort of infinite either way. So it's not like drawing a broader circle rather than a narrow one. A narrower one increases the amount of goodness, but now you're sort of adding imperfection to the mix. And so maybe that's still bad. And, fair enough, like, infinitarian ethics is weird. But I think a theist could at least reasonably have a position that's like, no, like, if you have two sets of good worlds, and one, like, you have one set of good worlds, and then you have another set of good worlds, which is a superset of the first set of good worlds, but every world that differentiates the superset from the original set is a good world, then like the superset is better. Like, you could, I think, reasonably have a sort of intuition like that. And then, then it seems like if you have that and you have the sort of way of modeling God's creative process that you mentioned, then it seems like the multiverse theodicy would be able to avoid the duplication objection.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense. And also, like, I mean, just to be clear, like, I wouldn't say like any of us are like, at all confident, like, whether which, version of like God's creative process would it actually be the one he employs. But like the point is, if you're not confident in that, then you shouldn't be confident in the problem of evil, succeeding either way, because like you're like 50-50 on whether God would like, create in the form of creative process A or creative process B. And if he does it in the form of creative process A, then it's not at all surprising that we'd see evil. So you should just not be like very confident that the argument from evil is successful unless you're very confident about like, what's the exact creative process, God would employ, which principles in Unitarian ethics are correct. Also, I should also mention like the duplication objection, you already need to make several sort of like, other controversial assumptions to even make that objection. Like one thing you need to assume is that the identity of indiscernibles is false, which like, that is like a popular view that it's like false, but that's not like trivial. Um, and then the other one you need
Sorry,
to
the identity
assume,
of the identity of indiscernibles. Just for people who don't know, is the view that if two objects, if in this case, if two universes are alike in all respects, then they are the same universe. So that's just to say that if God makes two of the exact same universes that are both the best possible universes, then he's actually only really made one because they're actually identical to each other.
Wait,
or another way to put it is like you can't make like two things that are exactly qualitatively the same but distinct. Like if they're different, then they differ in some like qualitative respect. So
wait,
yeah, you need to
couldn't
like
they be?
assume.
I actually don't know anything about it. Couldn't they still be like I don't know, like if I made like well, so like would if I had like if we made two universes, right, and they're like I guess maybe quantitatively, or sorry, if they're like numerically not identical, but qualitatively they are identical. Is like I don't know what the identity of indiscernibles. I don't know what that view really says, but like, would it just be that like, yeah, you could create an exact qualitative copy of a universe, but it would just be, it wouldn't be like the same universe. It wouldn't be truly spoken of as a duplicate. It would just be a different universe that's
No,
qualitatively identical.
the idea is like you can't have like a numerically distinct like universe that is
That's
like qualitatively
qualitatively.
identical under the identity of indiscernibles. Like
Huh,
it's like
okay,
just to
that
give.
seems sort of weird, but
Yeah. Like I mean, there are lots of like persuasive reasons to reject it, this principle. But I just want to like flag that it's like not like that it's uncontroversial to. So you'd
mhm.
have to be pretty confident that it's like not true. Another thing you'd have to be, I think, pretty confident in to run this objection is you'd have to think that in the first place there is such a thing as a perfect world. You know, like lots of or a best possible world. Like lots of there are lots of people who think that it's not true that there is like a single like perfect world or that there is such a thing as like a perfect world. A lot of these people think that if you um that you could always like make a better world, or a better world is like always like possible, or we can always imagine like a better world, and so there would be an infinitely ascending hierarchy of better and better worlds. Like I mean, just to give like some idea of this, like you might imagine that um like let's say that the things we like think are most valuable are that are going to make the most valuable worlds, or are going to make things the best, are going to be conscious creatures or agents living good lives, whatever you think that is. And so like then let's imagine a world with a bunch of people who live like just these like amazing lives. Well, you might think, well, it seems like there's no inconsistency or anything like that in either making their lives even better or adding more people with even better lives. And so you might think like, well, if you think you can always just like do that and no matter what, there's no like contradiction or inconsistency, then you might think like, okay, well, there's always just going to be a better world. And so then by this reasoning, we might think, well, there just is no limit that you would ever there just is no, limit where you're like, okay, this is the stop, this is the best world, if that makes sense. But so like, if there's like, no best possible world, then you can't say, well, why didn't God just like pick the perfect world and then like copy paste it over and over again? Like you might think, well, no, like he should just because like whichever world he picked, like say it's like a really, really good world, and he went to copy paste it. There's always a better one that he could have chosen instead to copy paste. So instead, you might think that either like what he does is he like if it's possible for him, he would just like create all of the net positive worlds, all of the infinitely many, uncountably many net good net possible worlds. Or like maybe you think like maybe there's some reason you think he can't do that, and so then maybe he would, like just like pick like a bunch of different sets of like, really good like possible worlds and then like pick between them at random or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's like, yeah, I mean, there's sort of good analogies I've heard people use for this kind of idea too. Like, I think like Dustin Crummett, for example, he gives this example of like, imagine you have this product called like ever better wine, and let's also imagine that you're like immortal, so you're never gonna die. And ever better wine, it's just this wine that gets better every day. You keep it. And it's also indestructible, and it's so it's never going to go bad, it's never going to be destroyed, and same goes with you. So it's just this wine is going to keep getting better the longer you wait to drink it, and then so the question is, okay, well, what should you do in that situation? Well, the worst thing you could do is just never drink the wine. So you're going to have to drink the wine at some point, but then that would entail that whenever you drink it, there was even a more optimal time you could have drinking it. And so you could always raise this like, oh, well, if you're perfectly rational and you always do the best thing, how could you, and then you say you drink the wine on, say, day like 1 million or something, right? Somebody could ask, oh, if you're supposedly perfectly rational and perfectly good, assuming that those are claims that you like make about yourself, I guess, then how come you drank the wine today when it would have been even better to drink it tomorrow? And it's like, well, look, I have to sort of arbitrarily stop somewhere and do this like necessarily imperfect action that I could have done better on. And so maybe sort of God does the same thing. Now, again, this would require that the world is at least like net good. And presumably, you might even think that for this to work, the universe would have to be like really good, because maybe like however long you wait to drink the ever better wine, you're going to wait, at least longer than like 1 day. Right. And so similarly, God presumably wouldn't create like the worst net good possible world he could have. He would at least stop past some threshold of like pretty goodness, and then create that. And then another thing you might imagine is that, well, I think that God only does this once, maybe because he can create multiple times, maybe he just kind of like is ad infinitum spinning this like infinite sided die consisting of like a bunch of net good possible worlds past a certain threshold of goodness, and then just creating whatever one he lands on, sort of as he goes in this sort of constant eternal process or something like that. That's like another way of thinking about this sort of no best possible world, the Odyssey idea. Yeah.
Yeah. And also another thing I guess like I want to flag for anyone who's listening, like another like thing, you might have to take a controversial stance on is like, well, we've been talking about him like creating, being able to create like more than one possible world. And on some views of what possible worlds are, that's not a thing you can actually like do, now, I mean, there are like a variety of things you can say about it, but the point is like, on some views, like for instance, like a kind of almost Lewisian like view, or as in David Lewis view of possible worlds, like that is something you can do. So like the point, and like on some views of like possible worlds, like maybe they, the possibilities like won't be fixed or be like co-eternal with God, or something like that. But the point is, like, what this means, okay, is that it's not just like theists who are going to have to make controversial, like, metaphysical and ethical assumptions to get around the problem of evil. If you're an atheist and you run this objection, you run this objection to theism, you run the problem of evil as an objection to theism, you're also going to have to make these like controversial assumptions. You might have to assume that like there is like such a thing as like a perfect world, that like possible worlds work in a certain way, or that God's creative process works in a certain way, or that certain principles in infinitarian ethics that are controversial are true and others are false. Yeah, one thing to say about that is, like, even if this idea, like, of him being able to create multiple possible worlds doesn't pan out, you still, like, if you don't think there's a perfect world, you still have another respectable, like, theodicy to go to, which is one we've talked about, which is this no best possible world theodicy.
Yeah, it's also worth mentioning, like, we're probably going to wrap up, so we can't really talk about any other theodicies, but I want to flag that the multiverse theodicy was not my answer to the question of what our favorite theodicy is, although I do think it's a good one.
Yeah. Well,
my sort of stance on the multiverse theodicy is that, like, it seems to substantially decrease the force of the problem of evil, because it makes the success of the problem of evil contingent upon a bunch of, like, pretty controversial assumptions about things like infinitarian ethics, perhaps. Well, maybe there's other objections that don't to the multiverse theodicy that don't. I mean, actually, there certainly are other objections to the multiverse theodicy that don't rely on taking stances on things like, infinite ethics and how God's creative process works. But I take it that, like, the duplication objection is sort of, like, in my mind, the sort of most obvious and strongest. The other ones I could see being overcome a bit more easily. But yeah, my stance is that the multiverse theodicy definitely strongly decreases the force of the problem of evil. I'm sort of hesitant to, I guess, like, stake my flag in it, just because I don't know what to make of certain questions that the success of the theodicy seems to hinge on. I mean, of course, that goes both ways, because that means that I don't know what to make of certain assumptions that it seems like the problem of evil then has to hinge on, at least insofar as there are no other decisive objections to the theodicy besides sort of the one we've been talking about most recently, which there might be, but I don't suspect that there are.
Wait, can you just say briefly what your favorite theodicy is in that case, and then we can wrap up?
Okay, so one of the sort of Hindu theodicies I'm kind of sympathetic to, or that seems like it has a decent amount of explanatory power. And, as a couple preliminary points, like, number one is, I'm sort of apprehensive about all of these because, I haven't consulted a lot of people to get their thoughts on some of these ideas or their criticisms. It's just that, I've been contemplating these and I haven't been able to find any obvious problem, and they seem to have good explanatory power with respect to the evils we observe. So I'm sort of advancing these theodicies apprehensively, or, like, these seem sort of interesting to me, but I'm not, like, staking my flag in them or anything. And then another point is just, any theodicy I would offer, like, I probably wouldn't want to say that this theodicy is most likely true given theism. It's more that, like, as long as we can tell some story that, like, is morally plausible and plausibly reconciles the existence of an all-good God with the evils that we observe, and then as long as we can say, well, for all we know, that story is true, then, the theist is in a better position. So it's not like I'm saying this is the explanation for evil given theism. It's just that, like, look, here's a story that you could tell that for all we know is true, that would reconcile the existence. And so long as we can tell such a story, then we're no longer justified in confidently asserting that there's no way in which the existence of an all-good God could be reconciled with the existence of evils. But anyways, so the gist of the theodicy, it's basically a fall theodicy, although it adds various other elements. It adds elements of a soul-building theodicy, or like a karmic reincarnation theodicy, and so on, where the basic story is just, look, as with most fall theodicies, we were created in an initial state of loving union with God, where we basically lived in paradise and so on, and everything was perfect. So God kind of did create the best possible world initially, and we were all living in it. But at the same time, God gave us free will. And the reason God gave us free will is that free will is a requirement for our ability to truly love God, because, love that's not freely chosen isn't really love. And people loving God is like this really great good. And so, God gave us the free will to basically reject him. So at some point, some number of these creatures that God created in loving union with himself decided to use their free will to reject God and to decide to live apart from God. And so through that choice, we ended up basically ripping the world out of God's hands, so to speak, and deciding to live in what many theologians would refer to as like an autonomous creation, a creation of God, which nonetheless God is to a large extent absent from. And again, the reason he's absent from it is because we freely chose to, decide to live apart from God. So that's by and large the explanation for evil. And then the purpose of our time here is to kind of work our way back to union with God over the course of our lives, or in the context of this theodicy, over the context of our many lives, because this theodicy also involves aspects of, like reincarnation and so on, which I think is actually very important, because there are problems with fall theodicies that I think emerge if you don't believe in reincarnation. But we don't have to get into that. And then another crucial aspect of this theodicy, by the way, is it's different from like the traditional Christian fall, because in the traditional Christian fall, like Adam and Eve decided to reject God, and somehow that implicated, every human and every animal that lives now to such an extent that, we have to suffer for the sins of, some of our forebearers who apparently made the decision to fall. And, you might question that and think like, well, why should we be held accountable by our forebearers' decision to fall? And especially why should like wild animals be held accountable for this? Seems like they didn't do anything wrong. And, the problem gets even worse when you introduce like natural evil or like evolutionary evils. But on this version of the theodicy, actually, the idea is that every single conscious individual who exists in our universe made the conscious decision to fall for themselves. And if you're wondering, like, well, how is it possible that many individual conscious creatures would make the conscious choice to fall? Well, one thing you could say is just that, well, look, plausibly, God created like infinite numbers of beings, right, to live with him in a state of loving union. And so even if like a very, very, a vanishingly small proportion of God's created beings try to or decide to fall, that would account for more than enough conscious beings to account for our observations in this universe. Especially in the prediction that at least some beings would choose to fall at some point becomes even more likely when you consider that presumably these souls that God creates exist for like an eternity. So they have essentially infinite opportunities to decide to fall. And yeah, there's other objections that I've thought of to this theodicy. to fall theodicies that I think you can solve by appealing to the aspects of like reincarnation. Like, for example, you might ask like, okay, how plausible is it that any conscious being would choose to fall and therefore live the life of like a fly on Earth, which lasts like 3 days and is very unpleasant? And maybe the solution to that is that, well, if this Hindu theodicy is incorporating elements of reincarnation, then you have like a more natural response to that. Because, presumably one's life as a fly is a very small percentage of the life that they're signing up for by deciding to fall into this reality. Whatever. Yeah, that was not a concise explanation. So we can cut that out if needed, but that's basically the theodicy.
It's interesting. Alas, we have too little time for me and Bro Machine to give our thoughts on this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have no thoughts, Doug. I've just been jorking it in the background here the entire time.
Also, in the library? Are you in a library?
Dude,
I am in the library.
Out in the library.
That's fucking nasty.
Asserting dominance on my classmates. All right. Cool. Well, I think that's it for this episode of the Rational Sophistry podcast. To get our undying love, please send an email to rationalsophistry@gmail.com with your bank account information and PIN number.
Yeah. And we also do have a Patreon. Like, help us out or we'll kill ourselves, please.
Yeah. No, if you send us your social security number, we'll run a background check and invite you to an orgy involving all of the hosts of this show, guys. 100% real offer. Henry
Definitely
will be there too. Ladies. Yep.
Yeah.
If you don't subscribe to our Patreon, we will every night, all three of us will petitionary prayer God to send you to hell.